One of the most significant cases that I've worked on is that of a young man that we'll call John. When he came to our attention, he had been hospitalized for 3 months already into what would become almost a 7-month hospital stay. And this is part of the mistreatment of children with autism, that school districts haven't addressed their behavior and communication needs. And so the students act out because that's the only way that they have to communicate, and they end up hospitalized when that's not really where they need to be. So we work with a range of children, and sometimes your goal with special education is to help someone live a fully independent and functional life. Sometimes that's not going to be a possibility based on the level of needs or disability that the child has, but we still want all children to live lives of safety and dignity and kindness and happiness. And this young man had been so poorly served by his school district that he had to be restrained. He was chemically restrained. He was in 4-point restraints. What's been really remarkable to us is a year into an appropriate placement for him, he's not violent. Violence was not his problem, and psychiatric disorders were not his problem. His problem was that he'd not been taught to communicate, and he'd not been taught appropriate social skills and behaviors. When we looked at John's early IEPs, they described a child who clearly had intellectual impairments but was charming and happy, engaged. He was eager to please his teachers. He had at least some interaction with his classmates. When he hit adolescence, he clearly hit some problems. And what was disturbing to us was that his IEPs never changed to reflect the changes in him, that they just stayed the same. And so for 6 years, he was essentially warehoused. It is one of the worst cases we've seen where his IEPs at the end of high school reflected the exact same goals that he'd had at the end of elementary school. Where in fact, if anything, where he'd been able to communicate and follow multi-step directions and answer the WH questions, he couldn't even do those things anymore. He had regressed and decompensated to a pretty serious degree, and this was a direct result of being in the wrong program, the wrong placement. The first thing that MAC did to help him was we filed an expedited hearing request with the Bureau of Special Education Appeals. When a student doesn't have a school placement, then they have expedited status at the Bureau. And John didn't have a school placement because he'd been hospitalized. There was no safe way that he could return home. There was no safe way that he could return to a classroom. The school district really fought us on this. They agreed that he needed the placement, but they didn't want to fund it. And so we went through quite a process simply to get him out of the hospital and into a residential school setting. We did finally succeed. But it took longer than it should have.
And can you talk to us about how John is doing today?
John is doing so well. He resembles the child that was described in his early IEPs. He has a sense of humor. He's communicating again both verbally and through assistive technology. He is able to go safely into the community. When we see pictures of him, he looks happy, he looks engaged. His teachers really just love him. It's a really wonderful thing to see what a difference a year has made in the life of this young man. One of our favorite pictures of John is him standing with his really beautiful and loving and supportive family, and he's wearing a suit because he went to prom with his classmates. And that was just a really wonderful thing to see. So special education is set up with a lot of really wonderful rights and wonderful things that children are supposed to have. But the enforcement mechanism for it is largely private. It really relies very heavily on parents to enforce their children's rights. And it's a complicated area of law, and this can be expensive and involved. And what we find is that if there is no one to enforce the right doesn't exist. That school districts will ignore these children's rights. So it's very important that an organization like MAC can come in and take on these cases and provide representation to families and children who otherwise could not afford it. Support from MAC translates directly into the work that staff attorneys are able to do. For every client that we help, for every case that we take on, there are many more who we can't help. Each donation to MAC, each contribution means another child who receives necessary services and assistance.